Somewhere along the way, you learned to edit yourself before anyone else could reject you. Maybe it happened so early you can't locate a specific memory. It's just a felt understanding you grew up with, that certain parts of you were acceptable and certain parts were not, that your anger made people uncomfortable, that your sadness was too much, that your ambition was threatening, or your sensitivity was weakness, or your joy was too loud for the room. So you learned, you adjusted, you became fluent in the art of self-subtraction. And if you've spent years wondering why you feel like a stranger in your own life, why you move through relationships and accomplishments and ordinary days with a persistent sense that the person showing up is somehow not quite you, this is where that feeling comes from. Carl Jung had a name for what you hid. He called it the shadow. Not darkness in the moral sense, not the worst of you. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is everything that was pushed out of the conscious self, not because it was evil, but because it was inconvenient, because it didn't fit, because the people responsible for your survival signaled, directly or indirectly, that certain aspects of your authentic nature were incompatible with belonging. Children are exquisitely sensitive to those signals. They don't need to be told explicitly. A parent who tenses when you cry teaches you that grief is a problem. A household that rewards achievement and ignores ordinary existence teaches you that your worth is conditional on performance. A dynamic where one person's emotional volatility organized everyone else's behavior teaches you that your feelings are less important than keeping the peace. You took those lessons in and restructured yourself accordingly. What went into the shadow was not random. It was specifically the parts of you that love, in its conditional form, rejected. Jung described the shadow as a living thing, not a static collection of repressed memories, but an active force in the psyche, one that doesn't disappear simply because you've stopped acknowledging it. It continues to operate below awareness, shaping your reactions in ways you experience as automatic, irrational, disproportionate. The sudden flare of rage at something minor, the deep pang of envy at someone else's success that you immediately feel ashamed of. The unexpected grief that arrives when nothing on the surface has gone wrong. Those are not character flaws. Those are the shadow announcing itself. Jung believed, and this is the insight that changes everything, that the shadow is not your enemy. It is your unfinished self. And the energy you spend keeping it suppressed is energy you no longer have available for actually living. Here's what the suppression costs you in concrete terms. When you exile parts of yourself early enough, you don't just lose access to those parts, you lose trust in your own interiority. You stop being able to distinguish between what you actually feel and what you've decided is acceptable to feel. Over time, the internal landscape goes quiet. Not peaceful, but managed, muted. You become efficient at functioning and gradually less fluent in simply being. This is what emotional exhaustion actually is, beneath the surface explanation of doing too much. It's the cost of maintaining a self that was never quite whole. Relationally, the shadow creates a specific kind of distortion. Jung observed that what we cannot accept in ourselves, we tend to project outward. The anger you were taught was unacceptable doesn't vanish, it becomes hypersensitivity to anger in others. The neediness you learn to be ashamed of becomes contempt for people who ask for too much. The ambition you suppressed becomes resentment of people who don't suppress theirs. Projection is the shadow's primary language, and it speaks constantly. Every time someone else's behavior produces a reaction in you that feels larger than the situation warrants, the shadow is probably involved. Not always, but often enough to make it worth pausing and asking, is this about them Or is this about something in me that I haven't been willing to look at directly? That question, genuinely asked, not defensively deflected, is the beginning of shadow work. Jung was unambiguous about the difficulty of this process. He called it the moral effort of self-knowledge, not moral in a religious sense, but in the sense that it asks something real of you. It requires you to stop organizing your identity around being the person who doesn't have those feelings, the person who isn't angry or envious or afraid or selfish or lost. To admit that all of those things are present and human and not evidence of fundamental brokenness. The confrontation with the shadow is not an act of wallowing, it is an act of retrieval. What comes back when you stop forcing parts of yourself underground is not chaos. That's the fear, that if you acknowledge the rage, it will consume you, that if you admit the grief, you'll never stop crying, that if you stop performing competence, you'll be exposed as the frightened person underneath. But this is the fear talking, not the reality. The reality is that emotions lose power in the presence of honest attention, not in the presence of ongoing suppression. What you resist genuinely does persist. What you witness begins to metabolize. The anger, when you finally let yourself feel it fully in a contained way, moves through. It has information. It usually points directly at a boundary that was violated, a need that went unmet, a version of yourself that was not protected when it needed to be. The shadow, faced rather than fled, becomes a guide. Jung's vision of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming psychologically whole, runs directly through the shadow. You cannot become yourself while exiling yourself. You cannot access genuine creativity, genuine intimacy, genuine aliveness while maintaining a curated self from which entire dimensions of experience have been removed. The wholeness he described is not the pleasant, manageable kind. It is the full spectrum kind. It includes everything. This is the shift that changes the relationship with yourself at the root level. You stop asking, "How do I get rid of the parts of me I've been taught are unacceptable?" And you start asking, what were those parts trying to protect? What did they carry that nobody was willing to hold with me? The sensitivity you were told was weakness was actually a sophisticated capacity for emotional attunement. The anger you were taught to suppress was actually a functional signal of where your limits were. The ambition you learned to hide was actually the forward motion of a self that wanted to exist fully in the world. None of these things needed to be excised. They needed to be integrated, understood, given appropriate expression, brought into relationship with the rest of who you are, rather than locked in a room you pretend doesn't exist. Integration is not a single event. It's a practice. It happens gradually, in the accumulation of moments where you choose honest self-examination over comfortable self-protection, where you notice the projection and get curious instead of defensive, where you allow an uncomfortable feeling to be present long enough to understand what it's communicating rather than immediately managing it away. It also happens in relationship, specifically in relationships where you are known rather than performed for, where you can say something true and watch it be received, where your shadow material surfaces and meets not rejection but recognition. These relationships are rare, and they are among the most healing experiences available to a human being. Not because the other person fixes you, but because being witnessed in your wholeness teaches your nervous system something it may have never learned, that you do not have to choose between being fully yourself and being loved. That was always the false choice, the one imposed by environments too limited to hold you. The parts of you that were forced into hiding, they were not the problem. The conditions that demanded their exile were the problem. And while you cannot return to those early environments and receive what you deserved then, you can do something more powerful. You can stop enforcing the exile yourself. You can stop being a smaller version of yourself in service of a comfort that was never yours to provide. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness he meant was not sin, it was the unlived self, the authentic, unedited, full-dimensional human being that got quietly set aside in the effort to remain acceptable. That self has been waiting, not with resentment, not with accusation, with the particular patience of something that belongs to you so completely that it has nowhere else to go. The retrieval of yourself is not a dramatic event. It is a quiet, ongoing, courageous decision to stop editing, stop managing, stop pre-approving your own interior before anyone else has even asked you to. You were not too much. You were in environments that were too small. There is a difference, and knowing the difference is where everything begins.